There we go. Thank you all for taking the time to be here today to discuss both the promise and the pitfalls of environmental justice mapping. As I mentioned, environmental justice mapping is really big and really buzzy right now. So we're really looking forward to getting into what does it mean and what might be missing from the conversation. So let's start with a bit of an introduction. I'll go around and can each of you give a quick intro about who you are and where you're working. So I'll start with you, Matthew.
Thanks, Ian. Let me just make sure I'm off mute. Yep, perfect. So, first, I want to thank you and Dr. Wilson for inviting me to speak at this session and, for organizing yet another symposium. It's truly an honor to be included in this distinguished panel. My name is Matthew Lee, and I am an environmental protection specialist at the United States Environmental Protection Agency. I am currently on detail to the Office of Environmental Justice at EPA headquarters, working on all things EJSCREEN, which I think hopefully by now everybody knows is EPA's nationally consistent EJ screening and mapping tool. I spent the previous 13 years in EPA Region 3 out of the Philadelphia office, where I dedicated my entire career to EJ and mapping, including serving as the region's EJSCREEN point of contact from the tool's inception through my current detail. I've also worked on several other mapping and EJ tools during my professional career, and even incorporated static maps, back when that was considered fancy, into my master's work at Penn, where I wrote about collaboratively addressing the growth of the port industry to ensure environmental justice. I do want to mention up front that I am not here representing EPA. While I'm obviously drawing on my experience at EPA, these are my thoughts and my opinions, and I am speaking to you as a member of the EJ movement, not as a representative of EPA. So thank you very much, and it is a pleasure to be here.
Thanks, Matt. Let's go to you, John.
Sure. So good afternoon, and thank you also for the invitation and the opportunity to sort of share our experience, around EJ mapping tools. So I'm John Faust. I'm one of the branch chiefs within the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, which is one of the boards and departments within the California EPA. So just broadly speaking, our office has a primary role in evaluating health effects of exposures to pollutants. We have a number of different programs, drinking water, air toxics, identification of carcinogens and reproductive toxicants and so forth. But my particular branch has a number of activities, including the EJ mapping work that we're going to be talking about today, which is the most visible example is the EPA tool, which we're now on our 4th version, but has been around for a while. But within my branch, we've also done a number of other mapping related efforts. Notably, we've just released a human right to water tool, which looks at the state's community water systems with respect to water quality, affordability, and accessibility as part of the implementation of California's human right to water law. And then also within my branch, we have a rather substantial air pollution epidemiology group that also looks at certain things like heat impacts. We also look at the benefits and impacts of the state's climate programs on disadvantaged communities and impacts of oil and gas operations as well. So that's the big picture, but I guess I'm mostly here to talk about EJSCREEN.
Thanks, John. Fern?
Hi, everyone. Just first of all, I want to thank Jan and Dr. Wilson as well for the symposium. I've only been able to join for some of the sessions, not all of them, but it's really been amazing. And thank you for those of you who've joined this last concurrent session of what has been a pretty intensive 3 days. My name is Fern Unnapan. I'm an air quality policy manager at the Environmental Defense Fund. And I actually sit within the science unit of EDF, and over the, actually, I was going to say last couple of years, but 7 years ago, one of the things that the science unit started to focus on is exploring new methodologies for mapping different types of pollutions at a more localized level. And we started partnering with Google Street View, so Google Earth Outreach, using Google Street View vehicles to first map methane leaks along pipelines in various cities. And then 5 years ago, we turned our attention to trying to see if we could use the mobile platform to map other types of pollutants, primarily criteria pollutants that are health relevant. And I'm sorry that that Crystal can't be here, because Aclima was one of our key partners, as well as community organizations in Oakland, California, which was where we first did our mapping. And really kind of my role has been to work with different stakeholders to see how the results of that new type of maps, the really hyperlocal maps, that the one we generated for Oakland allowed people to see different air pollution levels at about 30 meters or 100 feet. And so how to really translate that new type of information to be used to inform different types of policy. And I'm not a real mapping technical expert. My background is in urban planning.
Which maps have a lot to do with. So thank you all for those wonderful introductions. And so let's get into kind of the meat of the session here. Of course, there are a number of complex vulnerabilities and hazards that overlap and impact fence line communities and all communities, but specifically in the communities we've come to associate as environmental justice communities. So from geographic, social, economic disparities across that whole wide range, they're also contributing to health disparities and health hazards. So now what EJ mapping tools allow us to do is take all of those different factors and layer them over each other and see kind of what's for instance, a combined impact maybe, or what's going on and what's this disproportionate overburdening going on here. So a lot of opportunity just in being able to see things that we couldn't see before. But can each of you talk to how you see this mapping tool revolution being impactful and influential to the environmental justice movement? So I'll go back to you, John.
Sure. Yeah. So I'll start. So as I mentioned before, we've developed the EJSCREEN tool, and we're on a fourth version. But the program actually started, many years ago, with the idea that we were to develop guidance on this area of cumulative impacts analysis, and to try and start understanding, where communities are that face these multiplicity of burdens and ways they may be vulnerable. And we used a stakeholder process to sort of guide, this concept that a tool that brings this information together would be useful. So we had this tool concept, but it really was, I think, the statutory mandate of Senate Bill 535, which required that certain funds be allocated to disadvantaged communities. That really was sort of kind of a tipping point for making the tool that we developed both applicable to the identification of those communities that are cumulatively burdened, and sort of the allocation of resources to those communities. for those who aren't familiar, it requires that a quarter of the investments from the state's proceeds from the state's cap and trade program go towards communities that are disadvantaged as designated by Cal EPA. So clearly, the allocation of monetary resources to those places is a substantial use of the tool, and can be very influential in providing resources to disadvantaged communities. Of course, we've been transparent about the tool as well, and we've made the data available through a mapping interface that not only allows it to be used for the identification of disadvantaged communities, but also for people at different levels, local municipalities, individuals interested in their community, and so forth, just to provide a tool that has a sort of a broad suite of information that's folded together. So I mean, those are just a couple. I want to make sure everybody has time, and I know we have relatively limited, but I can circle back on anything later if it's needed.
Thanks, John. Matthew, you go next.
Yeah, thanks, John. And I'll talk a little more generally. I've heard it said that without mapping, the EJ movement would not be what it is today. I think being able to visualize the correlation between race and the siting of hazardous waste sites, for example, quite literally put EJ on the national environmental movement landscape. Albeit way in the background, but now we're moving forward. And really having move from those county level static maps, to the truly interactive tools, that we have today, some of which are providing, that single, cumulative score. We can now visualize and examine these correlations in much, greater and meaningful detail. The other really powerful thing I think that these mapping tools do is really inform and enhance EJ integration as a whole. Right? They are not standalone. These tools help us with problem formulation, with community engagement, certainly, and ultimately, making decisions, through that EJ lens, that everybody is talking about these days. Further, having all this information, the tool that these tools have, in one place, allows for resources and attention to be paid to the other aspects of the EJ integration process. So because someone was really, very easily able to, to gather all the necessary information, on community characteristics and the environmental burdens they face, that allows that person or that team to dedicate more resources to meaningful community involvement, for example, because they don't have to spend the resources gathering the information that the tools readily provide. So not only are these tools, I think, helping to obviously to visualize the correlation between vulnerable communities and environmental burdens, but they're helping to do other aspects of EJ integration. They're helping those be done better and with more resources.
Absolutely. And something you said, and so for the audience members, you might have seen on the program, we were supposed to be joined by a fourth panelist here who is not available to join. So I'm going to be jumping in here when I can. But you mentioned kind of the EJ movement being built on these mapping associations. And of course, we have Charles in the room, Charles Lee, who worked on toxic waste and race, right? In the United Church of Christ project to map landfills and toxic spaces with Black and brown communities back in the 1980s. And so mapping has always been this really strong piece of the puzzle in communicating what's going on in our environmental justice communities. So thanks for that. Fern, over to you.
I mean, really, I'm just gonna jump on the same bandwagon and chime in that, the kind of EJ mapping has really helped to put sort of EJ issues on the map, because and I really wish that our partner, the West Oakland Environmental Indicators Project, WOEIP, was here. I know Miss Margaret was supposed to join like yesterday. Because they're one of the pioneers in doing EJ mapping, right? The first project that they did and that gave rise to the name is started 20 years ago to bring in different socio-demographic health outcomes indicators and putting that together. I might just say a little bit more specifically about the projects that we've done with the West Oakland Community Indicators Project, which is really kind of the even more hyperlocal mapping, because in the Bay Area, at least, some of the communities were already identified as particular community at risk by the work of the air districts through different types of EJ mapping. But what our work with them have been able to do is to visualize air pollution patterns at the street level, so like within blocks. And what that has helped to do is pick up very localized hotspots, very specific facility hotspots, which you know, is not always available in larger scale mapping. That said, the data mostly just confirmed what the residents already knew. You know, maybe there were a few hotspots or streets that we picked up with our new data that were a bit of a surprise or were not suspected as hotspots. But by and large, our data confirmed the lived experiences of the residents. So while it allowed the residents to see more and have the data to point to, I think is what that helps.
Absolutely, and that kind of not exactly, and we'll be able to follow up on kind of this lived experience. We could have a whole nother panel on why do communities have to spend so much time and energy and effort proving these things in the first place, and who is in the room deciding what counts as proof. But this kind of gives us a neat kind of segue into talking about some of the pitfalls now. So as with all technologies, both new and old, there are important limitations when using these environmental justice mapping tools to identify or classify overburdened communities or areas in need of an intervention. So I'd like for each of you to speak to some of the assumptions and inaccuracies sometimes that are attached to environmental justice mapping, and how do we fix it? How do we improve for the better? So I'll go right back to you, Fern, for that.
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously a couple of things that I think some of the other panels over the past 2 days have covered some of it. You know, it really, the resulting map is as good as the data that goes in, and of course there are limitations to most data sets that that are available. So I mean, that's kind of very in broad stroke, that's one of the overarching limitations. So if you look at, for example, the socio-demographic dimensions that get included in as one of the indicators for a lot of the EJSM type tools, there are always debates about which indicators should be used that are going to be most representative of the populations that we're trying to really reflect. There's also actually some limitations in terms of we often rely on census data inevitably, and there are holes in that. It doesn't capture undocumented or unhoused populations. And in fact, in the West Oakland work that in recent discussions we've been having, in kind of the community emissions reductions air plan, we're seeing that come to the fore, where advocates for the unhoused have come to the table saying we're actually not reflected in this plan. And then there are also some populations, most often, and unfortunately, the indigenous Native Americans, who are kind of too small in numbers to be statistically significant. So there's that. And I think one other thing that I'll point out is the spatial scale of data. And I think that, that can affect the estimates of disparities. And I think, it remains to be seen, depending on what types of policies you're hoping the map will inform. There may be different appropriate scales to calculate and compare air pollution disparities. I'll stop there.
Absolutely, thanks. Over to you, John.
Yeah, and I would certainly agree with a lot of those as in terms of some of the concerns around mapping. There are a number of caveats that relate to both data quality and scale and uncertainty. That was a good example with indigenous populations. I mean, we think about that in terms of, for example, if we're trying to characterize water quality, we don't have water quality data for systems that serve the tribes, and we would have to enter into an agreement to obtain that data. So in many respects, it's a substantial data gap, and essentially an error in that if we're trying to capture a full set of the state's water quality, we're missing a piece of that information. And the same could be true for certain impacts in rural communities where there may be differential use of healthcare facilities and so forth that can affect how well we estimate health across the state. So yeah, and I think when we talk about scale, we're sometimes talking about like this averaging problem where we're using an area to we're representing an area with an indicator score, which might actually include quite a bit of heterogeneity. So we have some of these measures that are aggregating information, at a smaller scale than perhaps the unit that we're evaluating at, but ultimately we're finding a way to represent it in an indicator. And on the area of uncertainty, some of our census data has margins of error associated with it that can be quite large, especially when we get down to smaller geographic scales. And sometimes those errors are large enough that they don't really even allow us to know whether this is a low-income community or not, because it's just so uncertain. And we make decisions about what to do with data like that in our tool. For example, we screen out data that for example has low enough populations that we don't have reliable estimates, and the same is true for health outcomes as well. Sometimes when those numbers are low, we apply suppression criteria, and sometimes that means we have to take additional years of data so that we can aggregate information together to sort of get over that barrier. So we have these challenges, we have these gaps, and we have sometimes tools to overcome them, but we I think what's important is that we sort of, keep this at the front of our minds when we think about how to interpret, what a given measure of a given indicator is in an area.
Absolutely, and I think that's an interesting point for you to mention, John, because Cal EnviroScreen is a state level tool versus something like EPA EJSCREEN, which is a national tool, and so John, you're talking about not having enough data at the state level and having to screen stuff out. There are things that, and I don't know if I'm stealing, Matt, I'll let you maybe finish the sentence about, where the interplay of having the amount of data kind of limits what you can do and what you can include.
No, 100%, and this was something I was saving for a next question. But one of the very limitations of EJScreen, being a nationally consistent screening tool, is that national consistency. And we are limited, to these two data sets, which are collected on the national level, or national scale rather, which, as we know, are few and far between. So that's certainly one of the limitations. And I will say, you guys make it hard to go last. But one of the kind of different concepts that maybe I'll introduce, with the use of tools, or EJ mapping tools, is I think these tools being turned into the EJ Easy button. No matter how good the data is or isn't. Something I used to see, I used to run a lot of EJ assessments utilizing EJScreen for Region 3, and I would get emails saying, Matt, I need EJ for this address. As if EJScreen or the data it contains, was environmental justice. Or similarly, people trying to boil the EJScreen information, or the information in any of these screening tools, down to a simple yes or no on a single EJ column on an Excel spreadsheet, right? Like, that's not the intended use of these tools. And one of my fears is that, with the future development of things like a single cumulative score, while necessary, right, it's only going to exacerbate the bad practice of turning these tools into the EJ Easy button. And it's a concept that I don't really understand. I think people don't, for example, try to look for a yes or no for, let's say, climate change, right? I think generally speaking, people understand, communities experience climate change, and are impacted by different aspects of climate change. It's the same with EJ, right? Communities experience environmental injustice and are impacted by different aspects of these injustices. It's not yes or no to EJ. But unfortunately, people do use these tools, to try to make those determinations. As to how to fix that, I think constant integration and training. I think the more people understand what the data is, the limitations of those data, what the data is not, the better. And hopefully then the tools will ultimately be used for their intended uses, one of which is not yes, no to EJ.
Absolutely. And yeah, so just like you said, that does kind of go into this next question. But one thing that I didn't hear you all touch on, and so from the perspective of being one of the architects for another state tool, the Maryland Environmental Justice Screening Tool, urbanicity versus rurality as another one of those dynamics that isn't being adequately served by a lot of these tools, especially in many states. Most of the states, when you look at them across the country, have very large portions of their land area being in rural communities. And so how are we making sure that those rural communities are served? Are we looking at the indicators that affect those rural communities more, not more so, but in equal measure as the ones affecting urban areas? And one of the ways that EPA EJScreen kind of skews towards urban is the way that air quality is monitored, and specifically, despite a lot of, and at the national level, how air quality is monitored when we're thinking about things like ozone and when we're thinking about things like particulate matter. But at the state level, our regulations for collecting emissions data on CAFOs and industrial agriculture, with these Mickey Mouse bills and legislators saying that, oh, these farms, these family-owned farms are not contributing to air pollution in these communities. Of course they are. But the legislation, the policy, and the bills make it a non-starter for collecting that data. So definitely, I mean, it's something. It's one of Dr. Wilson's Jacobi-isms: bad science in, bad data out. If you don't have the science, the methodology, and the practices and the awareness to bring in, to know what data needs to go into the machine, you won't get good results out, and representative results out. So thanks for that. And so going further, kind of putting this in the context of the Biden administration, which is planning to develop new and even more expansive environmental justice mapping tools and climate justice mapping tools. Based on your work so far, what are some of the things that you want to see, whether it's processes and planning going into it or specific indicators? What do you want to see? What are some lessons learned that you want to see implemented into these new or any new tools going forward? Yeah, I'll leave it there. So John, go ahead.
Yeah, so I mean, I mostly would speak from my own experience and what I feel are some of the things that have made our tool and our process work. I mean, for example, I think we've benefited a lot from having a very robust public engagement process. I mean, with each version of the tool, we not only do these webinars, but we've at least before the pandemic, been able to go and have workshops in communities, talk to them about, the information that we see for their community and find out, whether there's something that we're missing, sort of getting at this ground truthing and seeing, ways that we can fold in additional information when we know it, and whether the information that we have is actually correct. And I mean, another aspect is sort of transparency, making sure we're very clear about what we do and don't know, and also making information available in a way that allows people to sort of interact with it and explore it. So I mean, I think these online mapping tools do a lot in that regard. Another I think aspect of how we've worked, at least, that I think has been a strength is that we have relationships with the other boards and departments within Cal EPA, who provide a lot of our data, and it helps to develop relationships in terms of both understanding what the data that are collected mean and how we can use it, sort of getting the the feedback in that direction, but also enabling us to provide information back to them. It's like, oh, it looks like there's an error, a spatial error, and so forth. So we have mechanisms of both receiving information and providing information back. And of course, they're also using the tool when it comes together. So they have an interest in both helping us and supporting us by providing the best information possible. Yeah, so maybe oh, and just the other piece that I might mention is having it be iterative and updated somewhat regularly so that it reflects environmental conditions as they are and vulnerabilities as they are, to the extent we can is another important piece. So I think sort of this idea of committing to longer term maintenance of the information is pretty critical.
Thanks, absolutely. Fern.
Yeah, I very much agree with John about the need for community participation and transparency. And on the point about updating, also, I think because that's hopefully would allow tracking of progress. So that's what I would hope to see from the tool, so that we can track progress over time and see whether some of those environmental injustices have been alleviated. I mean, I feel like the people who are working on this have a multitude of experts to help ensure that the tool is, got the correct scale for analysis, have the right cumulative score. So I'm not going to go into that, because I think that hopefully will be covered by the many experts that will be working on the EJ screening tool. But I think I might just step back a little bit and say that what I hope to see with the development of the tool is expediency somewhat, because I think just stepping back and think about what the tool is supposed to be used for is to direct and target fundings to the communities that need it most. And that, as many people have talked about, I think throughout this whole symposium, like, we have a unique window of opportunity right now, and perhaps over the next few years, to make sure that this gets done and that the money starts flowing. So I just hope that it can be done in an efficient manner, and that the different agencies that have to come together to provide data and work together to create a comprehensive tool do so efficiently.
Absolutely, that's a really great point about the timeliness and the urgency here that we're dealing with. Matt, other than it not becoming the EJ easy button, do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, no, I think I'll expand on what Fern was talking about with with tracking, and the scorecard that the executive order talks about, and while I'm certainly, just probably like anybody, very interested in what's going to be used, the criteria used to label, disadvantaged versus not disadvantaged, but I do think just as important as the data and the criteria that go into that go into making that label with the mapping tool, will be that scorecard and the associated guidance around determining benefits, and the allocation of those benefits. As we know, the benefits associated with with Justice 40, they're not going to be encompassed, within block groups or even within census tracts. Just like environmental burdens, they're going to be, the benefits are going to be experienced unequally, across areas where some block groups might be labeled disadvantaged and and others are not. So how do you account for something like that? And if you do consider a larger geographic area, like a county, then I do think you potentially open the initiative up to EJ washing, where counties are, or where we're counting rather, benefits that are fully felt by an affluent community, that happens to be in a county that was labeled disadvantaged. So I don't have a lot of answers for these questions, but in a lot of ways, I think, for Justice 40 to be effective, I think there are equally important considerations, other than what's going into labeling disadvantaged, what's going into labeling, communities disadvantaged or not disadvantaged.
Excellent. So we have maybe three more prepared questions, but I'm seeing some really, really great questions in the chat. So I might just do, let's see. I want to get to some of these audience questions. So we'll break from the plan, go into the audience, and if we have time, we can go back to what we had planned for. But one of the really great questions that I saw here was, what about issues of privacy and confidentiality, where uncovering problems can affect home values? And in the case, actually, in some EJ communities where you have a very adversarial relationship between some of the polluters and they're lawyered up, but the community is not necessarily lawyered up. And so this, I guess this actually kind of dovetails with one of the prepared questions, which was, who's the target for these data and for these tools? So on the one hand, what do you do when the tool that you're hoping to use to identify areas of need can cause harm in those areas by making that data more available? I want to hear from you guys about that interplay there. So I'll start with Fern. I feel like you got something on your mind there.
Well, I have some thoughts. I don't know that it's a full answer, but we actually have gotten that question, especially around the home values. We've gotten some questions of that sort, just given the granularity of the kinds of maps that we've produced. And I would say that what we're revealing, I feel like, is just a symptom of so many other like systemic issues that lead to the property values of different places, including EJ communities. So I don't know, and we have not seen it to be the case that by revealing air pollutions in more visible and granular, localized ways, have affected property values at least in the project areas that we've done, which includes different parts of Oakland, Houston, other parts of the San Francisco Bay Area as well. So, but I think one of the main concerns that we have is as those issues, the air pollution becomes, visible, and that the communities who are there right now advocate for solutions and conditions improve, they end up having a hard time staying, and it becomes like it gets into the issue of gentrification and displacement. So that tends to be more of a concern that we hear about than like, oh, home values depreciate. But I think, to the extent that the data has value for the communities who are most impacted, we have to put it out there.
Absolutely. And when we're talking about gentrification, we're also talking about, oh geez, I lost it. We're talking about NIMBYism. We're talking about, I had a point, but I'll yield to Matt and John if you want to add on to this, and maybe it'll come back to me.
Well, I think we're also talking about, adding labels to communities who have already been labeled, for a long time, and it looks like, with Justice 40, I think we might be using the term, disadvantaged, but putting the term disadvantaged, on a community, on a map, right? We have to consider how that makes the community feel, and of course that's not going to look good for, for like home values and, oh, this is in the disadvantaged community, good luck selling. But again, I think just the concept of adding another label, to communities that isn't necessarily a good one, is very tricky and is a dicey.
Absolutely. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what the speakers have said so far. I would say that, with our experience, when we were initially proposing the screening tool, and sort of had even created, the early version before Senate Bill 535, we heard a lot of concerns about stigma and what that was going to mean for communities, and whether it was going to have sort of the opposite and unintended consequences. But with Senate Bill 535, which coupled funding and opportunities for investment in communities that score high with our tool, really the conversation changed quite a lot, and we stopped hearing so much about concern about stigma. But that said, I do get calls from people curious about the tool, who want to use it for things like deciding where to live, and I can see having this information, which as Matt said, was in many respects sort of out there already, but now sort of consolidated into a single space. But it could easily become part of a set of information that people think about in determining where they live, where they work, and where they spend their time. So it's part of the background, but I don't see it as I don't know, a deal breaker for making the information available.
Absolutely, and I would agree with you that it's not a reason to not investigate further on these issues. Another question from the chat here kind of goes a little bit back to what we were talking about in one of the previous questions. With emerging leading edge tech, AI, SAR, I only know a few of these acronyms: artificial intelligence, not sure what SAR is, Internet of Things. How can we best leverage and integrate this new tech to communicate EJ in an understandable manner for vulnerable communities to utilize in their fight for equity? Thoughts? Anyone can jump in here.
I don't know the answer to that question. Yeah, I mean, I think we're definitely in an age where there's more and more information being collected, and we have broader tools or sets of tools for examining relationships between factors. I mean, I think the science will be telling us which ones are consequential and important, as we go forward. So, I think we look a little bit to the literature and what people publish in these areas about how different types of technology and analysis are used to for inspiration. But yeah, I don't know if I have any other great insights into how we best leverage or integrate it.
Sure. Fern, go ahead.
Yeah, I can just share kind of from my experience, and I think it's really hard to create tools that will be able to, for such a wide range of users, and inevitably those tools that are created for such wide-ranging users in mind don't work all that well for any one particular user. So I would kind of caution against that idea of like, oh, there's this kind of silver bullet tool that anyone can use. In my experience from our projects, what we've ended up doing is we said from the start that after the maps have been produced, we will continue to have EDF provide technical assistance for community partners to use the data and the mapping tools that we produced, if that is needed. And because when we went in, we didn't really know what the capabilities of our partners are going to be to continue to use the tool. So we just said, if you need us, we'll stay. So I think as long as like there are tools out there for someone to be able to use, but when we talk about impacted communities or EJ communities, the capacities and bandwidth really range so widely. I think that there's going to always be a need for some sort of translators or immediate intermediary capacity that's needed, depending on the community organizations. Like we work with community organizations that are like 2 or 3 people is that the staff body, to I've also worked with groups who have their own GIS experts who don't need our help to work with GIS. So it kind of varies, but as long as you make those tools out there and use those technologies that someone can use and someone else might be able to work with communities to use them.
Absolutely. And just on the Internet of Things component, you know, there's so much going on right now with low-cost sensors for air pollution. And so being able to put those on a map alongside, you know, an environmental justice and screening tool is something that we are trying to do with our Maryland environmental justice screening tool. Part of our center, a big chunk of our center's work is helping communities develop these networks of hyperlocal air quality monitoring sensors. But even at the national level, we might be able to see something with that. For instance, you know, with EPA bringing in purple air monitors for fire and smoke detection. You know, that's so now that data is on one side of the EPA. Is there any hope of bringing it over to the OEJ side? What's going on there, Matt?
Yeah, you know, I mean, we are always, you know, working with the different, you know, divisions and programs within EPA to try to gather that, you know, that very data. And I do, it is tough to kind of take this, especially and communicate the data, let alone get it in. But it, you know, it is tough to take this really kind of techie, you know, data and get it into a tool, you know, that and make it communicable to both those, you know, higher capacity and lower capacity community groups. You know, it's very difficult. You know, and that doesn't even address what you just talked about getting, you know, data from one side of EPA to the other. But we, you know, we are working to break down some of those silos, and some of it is simply, you know, how do we, you know, with purple air monitors, for example, you know, how do we incorporate that into a, you know, nationally consistent screening tool when there isn't national coverage for something like that. So these are all these, you know, these type of issues that, you know, that go into determining, you know, what information gets put into these tools and how it's communicated.
Absolutely. And I think a tag on to that is there's also a question about implementing machine learning, which I think kind of goes along with what we're talking about. Another question that I saw was about time trends, being able to put maybe a slider on the tool that says, okay, and as a way of tracking improvements or, you know, decline. Any ability to do that, or any thoughts on that?
That's certainly on the wish list for EJSCREEN. I mean, right now we do make all the previous year's versions of EJSCREEN available for download, so somebody could kind of track that, you know, and track trends of how it's changed. But yeah, like you said, you know, a slider to track, you know, how things have changed over time directly in the web app, that would be phenomenal, and it's at the top of the list.
Yeah, and yeah, I would agree. It's a great suggestion, and yeah, and it's been on our mind. And yes, I would put it at the top of things that you know, now, you know, with Calvin EJSCREEN that we've had multiple versions, we have actually a lot of data. You know, one of the challenges I think we've been talking about, you know, nationally consistent data sets, or even, you know, statewide consistent data sets, but I think here the gap for us is to have sort of temporally consistent data sets. You know, we've, in the development of Calvin EJSCREEN, had a heavy focus on, you know, folding in new and better data when we can, bringing in higher resolution for how we characterize things. So, you know, we've sort of left it that, you know, each iteration is an improvement upon the other, but it's different enough that it makes comparison challenging. So some of what we need to work through in evaluating changes over time is, you know, making sure we're looking at things in the same way, so that we don't have some artifacts of just having a better tool than we used to.
Sorry, I was muted. Anything to add, Fern?
Slightly away from sort of the federal or state level EJ screening tools, and a different scale of temporal I'm not sure if the questioner was trying to get at this as well, but some of the kind of the low cost monitoring networks that we've deployed actually allows residents to look at the temporal trend within days. So I know that that's probably not going to be something that's going to be available with the kind of state or federal level tools, but I wanted to point that out because it has its usefulness in that with that, at least the project in West Oakland, people were able to see the pollution's level change during different times of days that track with, for example, activities at the Port of Oakland. And that I think enables them to kind of be more like kind of just more data and more precisely targeting solutions when they see, oh, port activities also go up at nighttime, or there's like this truck parking lot that has refrigerated units using diesel that actually goes off in the nighttime, and they would not have seen that before. So, yeah.
Yes, definitely. That's a great question from the audience there. Thank you for asking that. Let's see, we've got 2 minutes left. I want to dig in a little bit. I mean, to the extent that we can. There's a very important question. We touched on about it with high capacity users, lower capacity users. What is the approach or best or better practice for rolling out these tools to a wide audience to make sure that community members, on both ends of the spectrum, or putting in place maybe programs to make sure that community members are getting this information in a way that they can use it? And so it potentially could go a whole another 30 minutes on talking about engagement, but just any thoughts on better practices of doing that, or maybe from what you've already been doing. So I'll start with Matt.
Yeah, thanks, Yan. I think generally speaking, creating very simple, user-friendly web interfaces, but that also have completely transparent data that can be downloaded, does probably help cater to both the higher capacity, community group, who may have that GIS person on staff, who can then download and slice and dice, the data. But then also that, that lower capacity group, who may be using a mapping tool for the first time, simply to satisfy, a grant application requirement, they can just go on the web interface and get what they need. So I think having both of those, a super slick and very easy web interface, but also, downloadable information is necessary. And this has been mentioned, but, I also think it's very important we're actively soliciting the feedback, from the community and offering capacity building. One of the things we did start doing with EJSCREEN, for example, we set up office hours, public office hours, to create that avenue of communication between EPA, and the community. And ultimately, I think that's probably the key to optimizing these tools for communities, both higher capacity and lower capacity, is communication between the government agencies who are mainly creating these tools, and the community groups who we would really like to see as more capable tool users.
Awesome. John?
So I mean, I would say that we have always had community members as a target of our mapping tool and our results, at the front of our minds. And we succeed to different degrees, I suppose, just because it is a lot of information, but it has certainly informed how we present the information, for example, using percentiles so that people can know how a community compares to other places, across the state and so forth. But invariably, you sort of get to this sort of tiering of information, meaning there's sort of this high level look at what the results look like, but then you drill down and you start getting into, details about, what's a different, site status, based upon our Department of Toxic Substances Control's cleanup regulations. Is it an evaluation site, or is it a cleanup site, and so forth? And some of that, carries with it a lot of jargon and is much less accessible. So, I feel like by having a tool that allows you to drill down, you sort of can calibrate, to your own capacity to take the information in. But overall, we start because we want information to be meaningful and understandable to community members. I think, as Matt said, it helps us to get feedback, and it helps us with communicating. So that's
Excellent.
That's probably the bottom line.
Thanks, John. Fern, you're bringing us home.
Yeah, I agree with all that's been said. I might just throw in, data visualization is really becoming, such a burgeoning field. And I think you see some really great examples in the private sector, and especially during this whole pandemic, the visualization of real-time data. I've seen some really great examples, and I wonder if that's the sort of expertise and creative expertise that could be brought to bear, that if those capabilities don't already exist in public agencies, a partnership with those who are really, really great at doing data visualizations for the masses.
Excellent. I want to give a round of applause virtually. Let me see if this will work. To all of our panelists. Thank you so much for such a revelatory, and why, just sharing your wisdom. This has been a really great panel. Thank you, John. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Fern. This concludes the final block of sessions for our entire conference. There is one more plenary session for the afternoon that I will put the link for in the chat. Next session, paste. So that will take you back to our Zoom webinar room. And the final session is on the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. There might be some more talk about mapping tools, because like I said, this is a Biden initiative that's coming down the pike. So I hope you've enjoyed this session. Thanks again to our great panelists. This is definitely one of the sessions that I've enjoyed the most, because I could kind of geek out with y'all about it. So thank you all, and I'll go ahead and close out this room. And so make sure you click on that link before I do that, and we'll take care.
Thanks, Ian.
Yeah, take care, y'all.
Thank you.
Okay. All right, everyone. Oh, Dawood, are you still here? Oh, no. Yeah, Dawood, are you still here? Did you leave yet? Darn, I think you might have left. I wanted to answer your question from the last session that I didn't get to. I'll send you an email.